Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our event, Shakespeare in a Divided America, with our distinguished guest, Professor James Shapiro. Our program this evening is the second of a fall series of programs at St. Olaf College on the topic of the presidential election in a nation in crisis, polarization, pandemic, prejudice. My name is Edmund Santuri. I'm a professor at St. Olaf College and Morrison Family Director of the college's Institute for Freedom and Community, the institute sponsoring tonight's event and the fall series just mentioned. The purpose of St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community is to stimulate and support free inquiry and meaningful debate of important political and social issues among students, faculty, staff, and the larger public. By exploring diverse ideas about politics, markets, and society, the Institute aims to challenge presuppositions, question easy or comfortable answers, and foster constructive civil dialogue among those with differing values and contending points of view. For help in organizing our event tonight, very special thanks go to Institute Assistant Director Eric Grell and Institute Student Assistant Jess Horst. Thanks also to Jeff O'Donnell, Joshua Wyatt, and the St. Olaf Broadcast Media Services crew, and to Andrea Galswick, Dan Hollering, and Carrie Vanderveen of St. Olaf Marketing and Communications. Finally, thanks to St. Olaf College faculty and students who have integrated their study with our program this evening, particularly participants in the public affairs conversation supported by the Institute, but also the Great Conversation program and classes in the history and English departments at St. Olaf. To remind our virtual audience members, you are invited to submit a question at any point during the discussion this evening by using the Participate tab on the streaming page. We are honored to have with us tonight as our distinguished guest, James Shapiro, Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University and globally renowned Shakespearean authority. In addition to his position at Columbia, Professor Shapiro serves on the Board of Directors of the Royal Shakespeare Company and is Shakespeare Scholar in Residence at the Public Theater in New York. In recognition of his extraordinary scholarly achievements, Professor Shapiro has been awarded Guggenheim, Cullman, and NEH fellowships, and has been inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is the author and editor of numerous books on Shakespeare, including the prize-winning 1599, A Year in the Life of William Shakespeare, published in 2005, Contested Will, published in 2010, and The Year of Lear, published in 2015. His most recent book, which came out earlier this year, is entitled Shakespeare in a Divided America. And it is the argument of this book that will serve as the focus of our discussion tonight. Finally, and with special poignancy, I note that Professor Shapiro in the past few years participated in 3 separate events, all on law and Shakespeare's The Merchant of Venice, with recently deceased Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. About Justice Ginsburg, Professor Shapiro wrote in an email to me over the weekend, and I quote, "She loved Shakespeare and didn't hesitate to use his works to drive home her convictions." End of quotation. And I think now, as, sadly, Justice Ginsburg lies in state at the Capitol, the first woman in our history so to lie in repose, we can all join hands and say with profound gratitude for her historical contribution, may she rest in peace, and may our country find peace, civility, and justice in determining her successor. Much more might be said about Professor James Shapiro's distinguished career. Jim, welcome. We are so pleased to have you with us this evening.
I'm honored and really delighted to be in conversation with you. It's a great program, and I'm excited about our conversation.
Terrific. Jim, as the title of our Institute's fall theme indicates, in this presidential election season, we are a nation in crisis. And one of our crises is a profound political polarization. The poles are many: pro-Trump and anti-Trump, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, right-wing, left-wing, libertarian, egalitarian, nationalist, internationalist, populist, enlightened elite, advocates of openness to different points of view versus advocates of uncompromising commitment to social justice. The list goes on. As a society, we're torn by intense and bitter disagreements over race, class, ethnicity, gender, religion, morality, economics, immigration, education, abortion, and reproductive rights, the pandemic and public health, policing, law, order, and violence, foreign policy, the competency of the Congress, the constituency of the Supreme Court, and the very legitimacy of the current presidential administration. We are a deeply divided nation, and you have written a book with the title, Shakespeare in a Divided America. It's an absolutely fascinating book, Jim. One of the most interesting things I've read in a long time. I could hardly put the book down. It's exquisitely written. It's adventurous, insightful, historically and literarily erudite, and politically engaged. It's gotten glorious reviews in places like the New York Times. Congratulations, Jim, on the book's success. Before we get into some of the specifics of the book, could you say some general things about the book's general central theme as indicated by the title? What has Shakespeare got to do with a divided America?
That's a great question and a great context for the issues that are in my book. The answer to your question is really two parts. The first thing that Shakespeare has to do with a divided America is, as you know, as the St. Olaf's Institute for Freedom and Community exemplifies, there are very, very, very few places of common ground in this country where people across the cultural and political divide can meet, share, and exchange and debate ideas. We become a country in which individuals drift towards silos, and there is precious little terrain on which we can meet. Shakespeare, from the Revolutionary time until today, remains one of the very few places where Americans left and right, conservative and liberal, can meet because everyone has studied, almost everyone. The last time anybody counted, 90% of high schools in our country require Shakespeare and teach Shakespeare. The Common Core, adopted by most states, singles out Shakespeare as the one author all American high school students should read. So Shakespeare matters in the sense that we can still talk through him. And we could talk through him about the issues that divide us so terribly, the very issues that you drew attention to. And I should say at the outset, Americans are not very good at talking about these issues. We're not good at talking about race. We're not very good at talking to each other about immigration or civil rights. It's just not what we are accustomed to doing. So Shakespeare offers us a way of engaging in issues that are otherwise too toxic or too difficult to address. The other thing that I should say is that the reason we can through Shakespeare and the reason we continue to talk through Shakespeare in this country is that his plays speak to the issues that have divided us for over 200 years. Issues of rulers who abuse their authority, issues of civil war, issues of the slipperiness of gender, issues of immigration and the religious and ethnic other, and issues of race as well, most notably in Othello. So that Shakespeare, in a way, offers a platform to engage issues that are really difficult for us to work through. And one of the great pleasures of my career working with students, working with theater groups, is to witness and to experience these conversations that in other parts of my life I really don't have. I don't get to work through these issues and grow and change.
It's very interesting. As I recall now in your book, you do talk about reading Shakespeare in prison context and the way in which that sort of raised your consciousness about the kinds of conversations that are made possible in the reading of Shakespeare.
I have spent a few afternoons in Rikers, one of the most notorious jails in New York City, where I would go with the Public Theater's mobile Shakespeare unit to perform a play. And these are not regular theater goers. These are jailbirds. And watching them, one day we would visit the men, and the next day we would visit the women, watching them respond to Shakespeare in a vocal way that's probably closer to an Elizabethan audience than to modern, quiet, polite audiences. When they saw something they didn't like, they would holler, hoot, and yell. And it made me realize that Shakespeare truly is for everybody in this country. It's not for an elite. And my understanding of these plays was transformed by watching these productions. I go every year until the pandemic struck. I would go twice a year with these theater groups that I work with. And these are populations that I personally have not had much to do with in my life. And they came to Shakespeare with an incredibly open mind and open heart. So it just underscores the way in which Shakespeare, whatever the difficulty of the language, continues to speak to all of us across, again, a political, social, and in this case, incarcerated versus non-incarcerated divide.
That's quite a remarkable witnessing. Jim, it goes without saying that we are divided as a nation over President Donald Trump. It is fitting then that in both the introduction and the conclusion of your book about Shakespeare and a Divided America, you frame the book's discussion overall with explicit attention to Trump. Indeed, you say that it was the 2016 election of Trump that prompted you to write the book. And you take as a point of departure the highly controversial 2017 Shakespeare in the Park production of the play Julius Caesar by the Public Theater in New York City's Central Park, a production that referenced President Trump in a very provocative way. Of course, Shakespeare's 16th century play follows history in depicting the assassination of Julius Caesar by Brutus, Cassius, and other ancient Roman conspirators. But in this public theater production, and here's the provocation, the assassinated Caesar was played by a Donald Trump lookalike. And for this reason, the production elicited a storm of controversy and protest. The play was staged in modern dress. Caesar had a dark suit, long red tie, red hair. And there are other revealing references by your report in the book. The association between Trump and Caesar in the production was unmistakable, it seems to me, and intentional. Again, a storm of controversy ensued. Now, the director of the play, Oscar Eustis, addressed the controversy in remarks before the opening night performance. The controversy had been stirred up earlier based on some preview performances, as I understand. And then we have the recording of the director's opening night remarks. This recording comes by way of the Public Theater's Twitter account, and we're going to play that recording now and get your reaction to it.
What I also want to say, and in this I am proud to say, for the Public Theater, past, present, and I hope future, for the staff of the Public Theater, for the crews at the Public Theater, for the board of directors of the Public Theater, and for Patrick Willingham and myself, when I say that we are here to uphold the public's mission. And the public's mission is to say that the culture belongs to everybody, needs to belong to everybody, to say that art has something to say about the great civic issues of our time, and to say that, like drama, democracy depends on the conflict of different points of view. Nobody owns the truth. We all own the culture. Welcome to the public. Welcome to Julius Caesar.
Jim, can you give us your take on all of this?
Sure. I get goosebumps just watching that. I was in the audience when Oscar Eustis delivered that speech. I think it came on June 17th, a Saturday night performance. And the previous evening, the production had been disrupted by the first of several individuals who rushed from the audience onto the stage. And the actors had no idea whether they were going to be confronted or attacked or injured in some way. And I've been going to Delacorte performances for decades. I've never seen anybody rush the stage in that way. And Oscar was responding the next day to this provocation. And he's an extraordinary director. He has, in the course of his decades as a director, done Julius Caesar 3 times before this, not at the Delacorte, but at other theaters around the country. And he wanted to do it again. He called me up about a month after Trump was elected and told me he was going to do Julius Caesar. And we had some conversations and exchanged ideas about what the text should look like. The idea of centering it on a Trump lookalike was his. And at first I thought he was going to choose somebody like Alec Baldwin and make it a kind of parodic version. And he said, absolutely not. His intention was to do this play seriously. And this took shape immediately after Donald Trump's election. And what's important to remember, as we are now at the other side of that election, and we have a new one coming up quite soon, what's important to remember is no one knew how Trump would govern. There were many people thinking in late 2016, early 2017, that Trump, having run on certain issues, would, like most American presidents, represent us all, speak for us all, and try to be a president for all Americans rather than his base. So nobody really understood what Trump was about as this production was taking shape. It's easy to read it in retrospect a little bit differently. And I should say that there's a long tradition of staging Julius Caesar in a hyper-political way. So that in 2012, when Barack Obama was president, Rob Melrose did a production in which an Obama lookalike was assassinated on stage. That did not stir up Democrats to protest or get Delta Airline to withdraw its funding of that production. But we were in a different world and didn't realize how different that world was until this production was staged and generated the enormous blowback from the right. And I'm happy to speak to any thoughts or issues that come out of this production, one that I was an advisor on and one in which I sat in the theater night after night, mesmerized by. It was a gripping experience because it seemed to speak to things within the culture that were bubbling up, but not yet visible to the pundits, the newspaper columnists, to poll takers. There was something happening in this culture. And this production gave it a local habitation and a name, as Shakespeare might have said. So it was riveting. And I should say one more thing about it, which was crucial. Oscar Eustis is openly leftist. Those are his politics. And the Public Theater is a left-leaning organization. And if we remember that 3/4 of New York supported Hillary Clinton and only 1/4 supported Donald Trump, in the Delacorte Theater in Central Park night after night, the audiences were overwhelmingly liberal. And what Oscar Eustis was trying to do through this production was to challenge liberals to confront what it meant to achieve their ends by undemocratic means. And as I speak today in late September 2020, we're once again in a world in which we are discussing every day what it means to achieve your ends by undemocratic means. So what Oscar Eustis wanted to do was to unnerve his overwhelmingly liberal audience. And the way he did it was, as artistic director, he had a sizable budget. He hired 50 supernumeraries, basically kids in their 20s, who would sit throughout the theater, a 2,000-seat outdoor theater. And they would sit quietly in this modern dress production until the moment when the Trump-like Caesar was assassinated by Brutus and his fellow conspirators, and at which point, standing up in ones and twos and threes and fours, they'd start heckling and screaming and challenging Brutus. It unnerved the crowd enormously, but it forced a kind of whiplash on those of a liberal persuasion. What have we done? Is it worth violating democratic principles to preserve democracy?
That's absolutely fascinating. I want to pick up on that description that you're giving now and kind of put on my devil's advocate hat for the moment and pursue a kind of devil's advocate line of inquiry related to what you've just said. I mean, you say in the book that after the 2016 election of Trump, and given your surprise, along with the rest of the country over Trump's victory, you lectured on Shakespeare in, this is a quotation from the book, "Some red states in the South to grapple with what from inside my blue state bubble I had failed to understand about where the country was heading," end of quotation. You were trying to understand the other side, understand other perspectives on what had happened. As you say now, and as you say in the book, the public theater's production had as its very point the consideration of opposing perspectives. I mean, you quote the director Eustace's remarks in support of that interpretation, as he said in the thing that we just ran, like drama, democracy depends on the conflict of different points of view. You also cite in the book what you just mentioned now in support of that reading of the performance, the fact that the director planted actors in the audience disguised as ordinary audience members, actors who stood up during the performance and expressed outrage over what looked like the depiction of Trump's assassination. The director's doing that, in your assessment, as you say now, was meant to challenge the largely liberal audience, contest any inclination of this liberally inclined audience to applaud the death of the Caesar-Trump tyrant. And you say in the book what you say now. Eustace the director, I'm quoting now, Eustace the director had set a trap. He was offering a counterpoint, a rival perspective. By giving voice to the opposition, he was forcing on playgoers a set of moral questions not unlike those Brutus was struggling with. That is, questions about how far one should go in trying to save democracy, all the things you just mentioned. Now here's the devil's advocate. Given your apparent commendation of the director and the performance for this reason, one might have expected in reading the book that your own argument in the book would have continued to stress the importance of recognizing competing points of view, both right and left, conservative as well as liberal, in an ongoing democratic dialogue. One might have thought that's where you were going, but instead it seems that what you give us finally in your treatment of this particular event is a pretty severe criticism of the way the right, conservatives, tried to shut down or cancel the play. And I want to make it clear, I think you make an incredibly strong case that some of these agents went much too far, threatening violence, using social media in aggressive and hostile ways, organizing disruption, showing up at the play, trying to block the performance and such. It's an incredibly compelling case. However, you leave it at that and end with this ringing indictment of the right. You don't circle back, as you might have, in the spirit of considering contending points of view and ask whether there still might have been some reasonable concern on the part of some conservatives, or anyone for that matter, about the play's depiction of what looked like Trump's assassination. I mean, finally, that issue gets lost, sort of buried in this ringing indictment of the right. I mean, what would you say if some conservatives press this line of criticism of the book, that on that matter, while you do affirm openness to diverse points of view, in principle, the affirmation is in some tension maybe with your pretty resoundingly liberal critique of the right? So my devil's advocate question, and by the way, full disclosure, I did give Jim a heads up on the question before, and not springing it on him as a matter of surprise. But I'm just wondering how you would react to that kind of criticism.
First of all, I'm from Brooklyn, so I'm used to giving and taking in conversation. And I grew up a stone's throw from where Ruth Bader Ginsburg grew up, and from where Chuck Schumer grew up, all feisty characters. It's a feisty neighborhood. And feisty conversation is the best kind. The best answer I can give, and I wasn't as explicit about this in the book as I could have been, and I'll try to be as explicit about it now because it's a terrific question. I had expected, and frankly, sitting through rehearsals of this production and watching it night after night, I had expected an articulate, reasoned, if not devastating, critique of the production using words, not violence, on the part of the right. I could have written that myself. That soundtrack was running through my head as I was watching the performance, which is to say that the performance should have encouraged a fierce debate. And if individuals like William F. Buckley were still alive, we would have had reasoned, powerful, razor-sharp critiques of what was wrong with this production from a conservative or right-leaning or right-wing, for that matter, view. As I said, anybody could have written that. I'm on the left, and it was quite apparent to me. But we didn't get that. And this is where one has to draw the line. I draw the line in terms of what you're suggesting about going further towards finding dialogue. I draw the line when words are met with violence, when words are met with threats of violence, when Oscar Eustis's wife and daughter were threatened, where the actors were threatened, where the Twitter and the emails that came into the public theater threatened to blow up that public theater, threatened bodily harm. So I believe in an America where debate is crucial, where conversation is crucial. I do not believe in an America where words are met with stones. And that is why I didn't go that extra yard that you were hoping I would go. I remember very well the last 5 nights of that run, sitting in the back row where the creative sat, and the tension, the fear of violence grew so great that one night, as much as I wanted to sit through the production, I had to get up and physically leave the theater because my chest was compressing and I was scared, physically scared, because I had some sense of what was coming. There was Secret Service involved, FBI involved, city police. I mean, there was a lot of security. And as I got up to walk down to the exit, security thought I was yet another person about to attack the stage. And especially because I'm a white guy in his 60s, I'm exactly the type that they were looking for. Luckily, one of the security people knew me and I wasn't cuffed and dragged off. But I can't convey to you and to your listeners the visceral fear of being in a theater that could have blown up because people were bringing paintballs to attack the actors and they were stopped outside the theater, and who knew what would happen. So again, you may differ with me on this. I'll meet anybody, anytime. Tucker Carlson wants to have me on, I'll talk with him. I'll talk with anyone. But I will not live in a universe where violence is an acceptable response to language.
Yeah, Jim, and that strikes me as an eminently reasonable position. And please understand, my point was not to suggest that you were wrong in that indictment. I think you were right in that indictment. I think what was being described was just beyond the pale. But we're still left with the question whether, in certain moments, certain kinds of productions are socially useful or not. So just to add some description to the trajectory that led into the play. The play's performance came about 7 months, as you say, after Trump's controversial election. 5 months after the resistance marches surrounding his inauguration, including Madonna's speech where she said she thought an awful lot about blowing up the White House. Just 1 month after the widely distributed meme of Kathy Lee Griffin's holding up Trump's severed head. She did apologize for that eventually. But my point is that I can imagine someone saying, you're absolutely right in your criticism of the way in which the hard right was protesting this with violence and threats, protesting this performance. But we're still left with this other question about when a particular kind of production is useful, when it isn't useful, when something might be, if I might use that word, canceled, when something needs to be left open, all the sorts of things that we're discussing now about the context in which free speech ought to be implemented, and whether there ought to be constraints, guidelines, that kind of thing. But you're absolutely right, I think, in your critique of the way certain dimensions of the far right went after that production. Very, very interesting stuff. But anyway, yeah, go ahead.
Let me. It's a very keen insight on your part, and it's a question that I've wrestled with really for 30 years. Do we cancel Shakespeare? There are Shakespeareans out there right now, friends of mine, who believe we should not stage The Merchant of Venice. We should not stage Othello. That these plays are provocations and that they are too dangerous and divisive in and of themselves. And I've advised any number of productions of The Merchant of Venice. I wrote a book called Shakespeare and the Jews. I've been heavily involved in most productions of it on both sides of the Atlantic, major productions of it, and in this country as well. And my position is really firm on this. It is a mistake. And I tell this, I'm Jewish, I tell this to anguished Jewish critics who say, don't do this play. You're going to stir up anti-Semitism. Don't do it. And my response is, the play is like a canary in a coal mine. And we within the culture are those coal miners descending into the depths and unaware what kind of toxicity is in the air. And we need Shakespeare, as provocative as these productions are, as provocative as it is to watch Othello strangle Desdemona, a black man strangling a white man at the end of that play, or Shylock to threaten to cut a pound of flesh of a Christian's heart. We need these plays because they tell us where we are at any given moment in our country. And unless we stage these plays, we will be wandering in the dark and unaware what hits us when it hits us, because we need those canaries in the coal mine. We need a provocative Shakespeare to challenge us, to get us to realize the gaps between our sets of beliefs.
I think you make a compelling case for that kind of free expression. Jim, can we move backward in time now to 1865 and to two of America's most famous Shakespeare fans, Abraham Lincoln, who loved Shakespeare, and, ironically enough, Lincoln's assassin, John Wilkes Booth, who was an actor and performer of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar figures in this historical setting too, by your wonderfully interesting account. Indeed, you say in the book that the play shaped John Wilkes Booth's self-understanding in his assassination of President Lincoln. I mean, could you say something about this now, and more generally about the role Shakespeare played in the lives of these two crucial figures in American history?
The extreme version of my response is Lincoln would not have been assassinated if not for Shakespeare. And that I'll try to explain and defend that. Lincoln became interested in Shakespeare from a very, very early age. His stepmother had brought with her to the log cabin in which he grew up a number of books, including one that had 32 excerpts from Shakespeare. And Lincoln did not have much formal education whatsoever, but he committed these lines to memory. They were kind of tattooed inside of his skull. And for the rest of his life, he would be reading Shakespeare and also reciting Shakespeare to anyone who would listen, and quite often to people who weren't all that keen on listening. And he was an extraordinary lover and reciter of Shakespeare. And in the last 3 years of his life, when he was in the White House, there were 3 theaters in Washington that did Shakespeare on a regular basis. And he would sneak out at night and sneak up to the presidential box and watch every great American actor perform Shakespeare. He had some over to the White House. He had those who were opposed to him politically, and he engaged them and he welcomed that conversation. So Shakespeare was critical to Abe Lincoln, and above all plays, he loved Macbeth. He wasn't particularly attracted to Julius Caesar, even though 3 or 4 of those early excerpts were from that play. John Wilkes Booth had 2 older brothers and a father who were extraordinary Shakespeare actors. His father had come from England, where he was perhaps the leading Shakespeare actor of his day. And he went into the family business when the farm could no longer sustain him economically. And he acted in a production of Julius Caesar with his 2 older brothers in November of 1864, 6 months or so before the election. It's the middle of the Civil War. It is an extraordinarily divisive moment. And his reading of Julius Caesar was very clear. He saw Caesar as a tyrant, and he saw Abe Lincoln as a tyrant. Yes. And he identified completely with Brutus and the conspirators. So there's never been a single reading. We have a complete flip here of how the play is understood. And he believed that he was a Brutus-like figure. And after he shot Lincoln, he leaped onto the stage and reportedly said, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always with tyrants, before he darted out the back of the theater, where he was chased and 10 or 11 days later was caught and killed by Union troops. So Julius Caesar was in the air. Every American really knew this story. And when Booth is quoting, in a way, from the play and citing it, in defending his views, you get a sense of, very powerfully, how in the mid-19th century, at the end of a war that had cost hundreds of thousands of American lives, Shakespeare mattered because it gave people a way of expressing their views. And actually, Booth left a long letter, which was read and then destroyed by a fellow actor, citing Julius Caesar at length in defense of his decision to assassinate Abraham Lincoln.
It's absolutely remarkable. And he even saw his assassination of Lincoln as a kind of, by your account, histrionic, melodramatic moral performance, even at the end when he was killed, demanding that there be a kind of valiant confrontation, which he was not allowed to have. It's just such an interesting evidence of the way in which a Shakespearean sensibility of a particular sort can inform an actor's sensibility. And I want to say, too, for him was a kind of histrionic, melodramatic moral performance that got bad reviews, I think, in the final analysis. It's rather interesting. And also the contrast that you draw between Booth's theatrical appropriation of Shakespeare and Lincoln's more philosophical, meditative appropriation of Shakespeare. For him, the speeches were occasions for profound reflection on profundities, the tragedies and the spiritual and moral perplexities of human existence, the guilt that sometimes connected with wrongful or even rightful exercises of power, the suffering associated with death and other forms of loss. So very different kinds of uses of Shakespeare or receptions of Shakespeare in that regard. Incredibly interesting.
It's a really important point, and it underscores that there's no single Shakespeare that is out there. I consider Lincoln the greatest reader of Shakespeare in American history, and it's because he felt those words so strongly that he could read tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow from Macbeth, and the personal and national tragedy would flow through him in the act of reciting those lines. But you're right, Booth was histrionic. It was all about the fight to the finish for Booth, both in his life and on stage. And it again points to the ways in which Shakespeare, on the part of the left and the right, on the part of a white supremacist like John Wilkes Booth, and the part of a man who freed the slaves like Abraham Lincoln, Shakespeare could be weaponized. And I don't flinch from saying that. I think it's important to say he's not often weaponized, but he has been and can be. And I think we have to be aware of that, whether we're talking about Lincoln and Booth or the Delacour production or John Quincy Adams or other moments in our nation's history.
Speaking of John Quincy Adams, another interesting chapter in your book. Of course, Quincy Adams, 6th President of the United States. But after the presidency, spent a good bit of time in the House of Representatives and became a famous abolitionist. But the matter is a little more complicated than that, isn't it, Jim? Perhaps you could say a little bit about that.
And before I wrote this book, John Quincy Adams was one of my heroes. He remains a hero, but he's a tarnished hero. And John Quincy Adams, as many of you know, was a committed foe of slavery. He went back into the House after serving as president in order to fight slavery, in order to fight the expansion of slavery into Texas. And he famously fought the Amistad case in front of the Supreme Court. He was considered one of the fiercest foes of slavery in America. And to my mind, he was a great liberal, if we can think of him anachronistically in that way. But he was also a guy who couldn't wrap his head around the idea of a white woman falling in love with and marrying a black man, something called amalgamation in his day. We use the term miscegenation. And it exemplifies for me 2 or 3 things. One, liberals like to think that they are free of prejudice, and this chapter in the book is a harsh reevaluation of that. The next thing it exemplifies for me is we're not really good at talking about what we really believe. And John Quincy Adams left endless notebooks, which are all available for perusal up in Massachusetts. And the one thing he never wrote about in his diary or in his public speeches was miscegenation, except in the aftermath of what must have been the worst recorded dinner party in history in the early 1830s, when he was seated next to Fanny Kemble, a star British actor who was 4 decades younger than he was. And he started mansplaining Shakespeare to the leading Shakespeare actor in the world at that time. And he wasn't prepared for the fact that she went home and wrote down what he said. And what he said basically was that Othello was disgusting, the play that is, and he used the N-word in describing how Desdemona, in marrying a black man, got what she deserved, got her just deserts, was killed for this. And all this dark stuff starts spilling out in an essay he writes and publishes on the character of Desdemona. And it was a little heartbreaking for me to see this story unfold, but also to recognize that we all have a distance to go. We all have and harbor views of others, whether they're political others or racial others or people from different countries, and we have to recognize that and be honest about it. But Shakespeare gave him a way of expressing ideas that he was quite proud of having published, and which we now cringe at reading today.
Yeah, that was a tough chapter to read, and fascinating because so surprising, but quite tough to read. A good number of our students who are watching tonight have read, studied, and discussed The Tempest. And you have a chapter in your book on The Tempest. This is a play, of course, written and performed toward the end of Shakespeare's career, not quite as well known generally as some other of Shakespeare's plays. Quickly, it's about a man named Prospero, a magician and former Duke of Milan, who was overthrown and is living in exile on an island with his daughter Miranda and two servants, Ariel, a spirit, and Caliban, a native of the island and half-human monster who has been raised and enslaved by Prospero. In your account, Jim, of The Tempest, you focus on the character of Caliban, and you show the way in which this character figures significantly in debates about immigration in this country in the early part of the 20th century. It's quite interesting because it's sort of in tension with some more recent readings of the play. But I wonder, could you say something about what was happening at the beginning part of the 20th century about immigration and how this Caliban figure of The Tempest plays in those public discussions?
I'm always interested in the value a play has for different generations in America. And for the first 100 years of this country, The Tempest, although an extraordinary play, didn't matter at all. Hardly ever staged. No one really wrote about it. It wasn't valued very highly. In England and in Britain, it was staged quite often, but not in America because it didn't speak to our concerns. It only floated into visibility at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. And it did so because of Caliban. And Caliban became a stand-in for the immigrant, for the unwashed, non-Anglo-Saxon, dangerous figure. And by 1916, when those who were opposed to immigration had been fighting to close the gates of America, but had been very successful in turning this into a country that once believed we welcome those who were oppressed. We welcome those from foreign shores. We welcome my ancestors. We welcome my wife's Irish ancestors. We welcome Donald Trump's German ancestors. And we were a place everybody could come to. But at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, with large numbers of Southern Europeans and Eastern European Jews coming to America, there was a fear that what was imagined to be an Anglo-Saxon nation was imperiled. And when Donald Trump speaks of people from Nordic nations rather than from S-hole nations coming to America, he's speaking directly to this moment when The Tempest rose into visibility. Nowadays, students study The Tempest in high school and college, and it's a kind of a template for the post-colonial world and the world of imperialism. But 100 years ago, it was really about immigration. And in my chapter on The Tempest and Caliban and immigration, I write about other liberals who were trying to stage a play, public play, a large scale, 100,000 audience members seeing a production outside of New York and then in Boston, Caliban on the Yellow Sands. And while the intent was to show that Caliban could be integrated, the immigrant could be integrated, it had, in a way, the opposite effect. It showed the ways in which America was uncomfortable with the other, was uncomfortable with this beastly figure. And once again, Shakespeare became, in America, a way of navigating through really complicated and, for many people, conflicted issues. And of course, in 1924, the gates were shut again and would not be open until 1965. And right now, we're on the verge of either allowing more immigrants to come into this country, or if Donald Trump wins again, sealing off our borders for a considerable time to come. So I imagine that this play is going to have fresh life in in the coming years once COVID allows us to reopen the theaters.
Yeah. You mentioned the post-colonial readings of the play. Can you say a little bit about those? You don't talk about those in the book, but what's involved there?
Well, again, this falls under my weaponization argument that Shakespeare becomes a way of attacking empire, showing its abuses. For a very long time, Prospero was seen as a benevolent older man, a kind of father knows best figure. And increasingly, especially over the past 3 decades, he's been shown to be an oppressor, somebody who oppresses Ariel, somebody who oppresses Caliban. I remember an extraordinary production I saw in the 1980s that Sam Mendes, the filmmaker and great director of Shakespeare as well, had done in Stratford-upon-Avon. And Simon Russell Beale, an extraordinary British actor, was playing Ariel. And Ariel is usually played by a kind of light man or just as often a woman who flits around on stage. And Simon Russell Beale was solid. And he played the servant, the willing servant to Prospero until the very end of the play when Prospero says to Ariel, "I set you free." And in a lot of productions like Peter Pan, Ariel skitters away happily and grateful. In this production, having earned his freedom, Simon Russell Beale as Ariel turned to Prospero and spat a wad of spit right in his face. And he was tired of taking it. He was tired of the inequality. And it was so shocking that British critics demanded that the spitting be removed before the play transferred from Stratford to London. So that's a British example of the kind of turn in this. But once again, it shows how powerful Shakespeare is and how readings of the plays change over time as we and what we value and what we fear change over time.
You know, in preparation for our event tonight, I was reading around in a number of books on Shakespeare, and I returned to a book that I read some years ago, Harold Bloom's Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human. And I want to read you a quotation from his commentary on the Tempest and just get your reaction to it. It picks up on some of the things you're talking about now. He says, "Caliban, poignant but cowardly and murderous half-human creature, his father a sea devil, whether fish or amphibian, has become an African Caribbean heroic freedom fighter. This is not even a weak misreading. Anyone who arrives at that view is simply not interested in reading the play at all. Marxists, multiculturalists, feminists, nouveau historicists, the usual suspects, know their causes, but not Shakespeare's plays." I'm wondering what you would say in response to Bloom's characterization there.
Well, I said about 1,600 words of it when I reviewed it on the cover of the New York Times when the book first came out. And Harold Bloom, who I admire this side idolatry, the late Harold Bloom, never spoke really with me again after that. I would say 2 things. One, it boils down to how carefully you read the play. And if you look at the play, it's only the other characters who describe Caliban as Booth takes as an accurate description, as this half fish, half monstrous, smelly figure. Well, my ancestors were described in that way, and maybe your ancestors or the ancestors of those listening to this program have been described. Those are the ways that aliens have always been described. And a disaffected, resentful Harold Bloom decided again to weaponize Shakespeare in this way and to insist that his reading, or I would say misreading of this play, spoke to the ignorance of those who didn't share his view. I would have loved to have had you sat the 2 of us down with texts of the Tempest in front of us and gone through these lines and argued them back and forth. And I suspect I could have made a pretty strong argument to Harold Bloom that he was letting his politics lead his reading of the plays.
It's compelling. As I mentioned, there are a number of our students who have been studying the Tempest, been working real hard in trying to come to terms with the play, and have come up with a few questions that they would like to put to you, as conveyed to us electronically. So I'm going to repair to those questions now and see how you react. This one is from the Great Conversation program from Professor Petter Jothen's section. I'm afraid the students are not identified. I wish I could identify the students, but I can't. Here's the question. Are there limits to the interpretability of the characters like Caliban in The Tempest? Seeing how Shakespeare did not intend to comment on colonialism, race, or immigration, yet centuries later, performances seem rooted in these concepts. Is there the need to return to an authentic Shakespeare, or should directors have the leeway to change and modify such a play to suit the context?
I love that question, and it's a very smart and probing question. Let me give an example from a different play and then circle back, if I can, to The Tempest. Shakespeare wrote Richard II in 1595 or so. And if you will, that was the authentic moment in which it was first staged. And 7 years later, when a group of disaffected aristocrats led by the Earl of Oxford wanted to challenge, if not overthrow, Queen Elizabeth's government, they asked Shakespeare's company, and they paid Shakespeare's company, to stage Richard II in an overtly political way. That coup did not succeed. Shakespeare's company was called in to defend themselves, and they just said, well, they asked us to put on an old play, denying the fact that that play over time had become topical and edgy and clearly was intended to expose a weak and dangerous monarch, i.e. Queen Elizabeth. So my response is, there is no authentic Shakespeare. Shakespeare revised his plays. Shakespeare understood that his culture was constantly changing. And to cite a play we talked about earlier, Julius Caesar, there's a wonderful moment when the conspirators standing over the body of the dead body of Julius Caesar speak of how many ages hence, in different languages, in different countries, will people be reenacting what we are staging in real life today? And that was Shakespeare's way of saying, I'm releasing these plays into time, into history. There is no authentic Shakespeare. When people ask me, after seeing a modern dress production, why can't they just do it in doublet and hose? I tell them that doublet and hose was modern dress in Shakespeare's day. So I hear as part of that question a desire for some fixed point with what Shakespeare's meaning is. There is none. All there is conversation and argument and discussion, which tell us more about ourselves and our values and our changing values than in a way they tell us about Shakespeare. And I suspect that's the way Shakespeare wanted it.
Are you willing to go so far as to say that there are no misreadings of Shakespeare?
There are bad productions of Shakespeare. There are productions that don't speak to what matters. And they're driven by directorial desires to impose something that doesn't seem germane. But there's not a production of Shakespeare that at one point or another I am not challenged by. That's what I value in the plays. Are there misreadings of particular words and lines? Sure, I could go back to the Oxford English Dictionary and tell you that word X or word Y did not mean what we think it means because it had a different meaning in Shakespeare's day. Those are explicit misreadings, and that's fine. But interpreting character, Shakespeare gives actors lines, and the actors create character. And the culture shapes those characters. And that is why it never gets dull. It never gets boring. When you settle in to watch a Shakespeare show, you're ready to strap in for the ride.
It's interesting because you've anticipated another question that came forward from Karen Marslick's section of the Great Con. Is there such a thing as a correct versus incorrect interpretation of Shakespeare? If so, how do we make that claim? So you've anticipated that and answered quite nicely.
I mean, they're boring productions and they're exciting productions.
Great. A related question, another question from a student, Petter Jothan's section of the Great Conversation. Is there a way to stage the Tempest in a politically neutral fashion? Can Shakespeare generally be staged in politically neutral ways?
I would respond. These are great questions. And obviously the teachers and students in this class are deep into the play and getting to high level questions pretty quickly. I would say, is it possible to live in America today and be politically neutral? And the same would obtain with Shakespeare. These plays don't invite neutrality. Our culture doesn't allow for neutrality. When we go into our polling booths or cast early ballots, we have to choose. We have to vote for candidate A or candidate B or write in a third candidate. But there's no little box that says, I remain neutral on this subject. And I would say that I know a lot of people who want to retreat to Shakespeare to find neutrality as an escape from the reality of the divisions that surround us. But I would rather urge that we embrace those divisions and embrace conversation, embrace the kind of discussions that your Institute for Freedom and Community is committed to. And in my world, in the Shakespeare world, committed to conversations through productions. So the short answer is no, there is no neutral staging of Shakespeare, nor could there be any more than anyone could remain neutral on the question of Black Lives Matter or defunding the police or closing immigration off in America. You just have to make decisions, and it's the same when it comes to Shakespeare.
Another question from Karen Marslick's section of the Great Conversation. Am I right in thinking McCain, that's the guy I think that did the mask, the Tempest mask, Caliban, interprets Caliban's desire as a desire for Prospero's knowledge and education within the context of the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon culture and Western canon? That's, as you pointed out in your chapter. I automatically thought Caliban was solely interested in his own personal freedom. What is a common interpretation for Caliban's motivations now, in Shakespeare's time? Education, freedom, something else? There's a lot of things going on there in the question, a very rich question. How would you react to what's being posed there?
You know, when Caliban cries out freedom, freedom, he's also half drunk. And you have to decide whether his cries for freedom are genuine or compromised. And it's very easy to mock Caliban, and it's very easy to celebrate Caliban. And I prefer productions in which Caliban is not physically turned into some sci-fi figure out of Harold Bloom's imagination. And I prefer him to be a simple human being. But whether he's Black or white or Hispanic changes the way we respond to him in a theater. So again, there's a difference between Shakespeare on the page and Shakespeare on the stage, where we can't avoid confronting our attitudes and differences and indeed prejudices. And society changes. I stand in front of my own Shakespeare class and have for 30 years and ask how many of my students celebrate Brutus as the great figure who is opposing tyranny in Julius Caesar. And when I began my teaching career at Columbia back in the 80s, overwhelmingly, my students celebrated Brutus. Now, when I ask that question, they think he's a kind of pointy-headed academic with leather patches on his tweed jacket who's just clueless of what the situation really is. So society changes, and Shakespeare, again, lets us see that. And these questions and the desire I've heard from some of these questions for either an authentic view of Caliban and Shakespeare, or for fixing him, speak to my mind to a desire in a dizzying world to have more clarity, and that Shakespeare should afford us that clarity. Shakespeare is simply a mirror that is showing us how unclear our present and perhaps our future is.
Another question from the great conversation, Karen Marslick's section. You mentioned how Shakespeare's comedies, this is in your chapter on Caliban, you mentioned how Shakespeare's comedies tend to end with an in-group and an out-group, which has been used to justify claims for restricted immigration. If you were to offer a counter-argument in favor of immigration, what tropes of Shakespeare would you focus on?
That's a wonderful, wonderful question. I'll give it a two-part answer. The first part, really, just to flesh out that argument, is we come to an end of a Shakespearean comedy, and it's really joyous. There's feasting, there's music, there's dancing, there's marriage, there's happiness. And at the time, Shakespeare is very clever. What he does in comedy after comedy is find somebody to demonize and exclude. So Shylock is not allowed into that comic community, that charmed community at the end of The Merchant of Venice. Malvolio is not allowed into that community at the end of Twelfth Night. Jaques stalks off at the end of As You Like It. Caliban is left on the island at the end of The Tempest. So Shakespeare understands that community is created by exclusion as well as by inclusion. Were I to answer the question of how I could come up with a counter narrative to that, I would allude to a play that is a collaborative play written at the end of the 16th century called Sir Thomas More. And Shakespeare almost surely was responsible for one of the scenes in that play. And he is associated with the playwright called Han Dee. We identify with Shakespeare's own handwriting. And it's an extraordinary speech in which Sir Thomas More confronts an angry anti-immigrant mob, a May Day mob in the early 16th century. And he says to them, "We may be immigrants one day. Why would you be so hostile, so cruel when you see the suffering of immigrants?" So whatever Shakespeare's own position, and I have no idea what Shakespeare's position on politics, on sex, on the monarchy, on anything was. The brilliance of his plays is he created a collision between competing points of view again and again. But in that speech in Sir Thomas More, he gives voice to what I consider an extraordinary moment of sympathy for immigrants in a very xenophobic culture.
Here's just a comment we received in real time from Deb of Chicago, Illinois. I just want to thank you for this presentation. I am teaching argumentative writing to my students. I plan to discuss your presentation with them and the events surrounding the play. Thank you, Deb.
Thank you, Deb. And I began my career teaching argumentative writing in Chicago at Central Y Community College back in the 70s. So I recognize the challenge you're facing and applaud you and all other teachers listening in who are on the front lines of these challenges.
Here, another real-time message from Sharon from Minnesota. I agree with continuing to do all the plays. What is your opinion of removing provocative statues, etc., that provoke good discussion but many want removed?
Wow, the statue question is a great, great question. And it's one that I don't have an easy answer to for the same reasons that I've been sharing, which is to say that things change over time, and it's important not to erase or efface the past. And I think there is a danger in sanitizing the past. I think there's a danger when President Trump announced last week he was interested in offering an alternative to 1619 by educating American young about 1776 instead. The statues that litter this country, the statues of Confederate heroes put up for the most part in the early 20th century and in response to the civil rights movement in the 60s, are part of our national story. Do I want them staring down at a population from central markets and squares in America? I don't. I would like to see statues preserved, not destroyed. I would like to see museums for those statues, and I'd like to see contextual material provided about them so that we could have a much better understanding of what we have been fighting over for 200 years. There was a man who left a statue for John Wilkes Booth celebrating the fact that he had assassinated Lincoln. And it was one of the first statues probably torn down in America in 1918 or 1920. And I would love to be able to visit that statue and see, or that tombstone as it was, and see what motivated somebody to do that. So I'm not in favor of erasing history. I am in favor, certainly, of locating it in a way that is not part of an oppressive system.
Thanks. This is from Carlo Veltri's section of The Great Conversation at St. Olaf College. This is from class of 2023. Keeping in mind what Caliban has come to symbolize in terms of immigration and minorities, why do you think that Shakespeare chose to leave Caliban's ending so open-ended in The Tempest?
People understood that his ending was open-ended from the very beginning. And almost immediately, or not almost immediately, by the end of the 17th century, there were continuations of The Tempest written to account for that. Tempest 2 or Tempest 3 in our Star Wars terminology. I think Shakespeare loved to leave endings open-ended. He is interested in driving towards closure, then unraveling that closure. And when you read The Tempest and you get to the end of the play, it's for you to decide whether Caliban is abandoned and isolated and left behind, or he finally gets to have, as he says, this island's mine by Sycorax my mother. Does he reclaim that island and change in his viewpoint from the experience of having Prospero having come and taken that away from him? So Shakespeare is undecided, and I think we get to decide in our own personal readings and in our stagings of the play what ending speaks most truly to the reality that we feel.
Thank you. This is from Adam, class of 2014 from St. Paul, Minnesota. I appreciated Shapiro's argument about the Julius Caesar Delacorte theater production that violence ought not to be a response to the language, but I was challenged by his story of Booth's weaponizing of Julius Caesar as justification and incitement to violence. Is there a way to see the alt-right response to the Delacorte production as, in a similar vein as Booth, an appropriate interpretation response to Shakespeare's play?
I think, again, we have to draw the line at violence, and we have to draw a very hard line there. One of the things that I left out of the body of my book, but put in the appendix to my book, was the name of the person who first raced onto stage and stopped the production. And her name was Laura Loomer, and she's currently running for a Republican slot in Florida's 21st district. So there are people who use violent activities to promote their own careers. So it's not simply acts of violence, but where violence can get you. And I think the violence that John Wilkes Booth committed got him what he deserved, which was to be captured, and when he refused to surrender, shot and killed. And I think that those who think that violence is acceptable in this country, who are going to be showing up to polling places with automatic weapons shouldered, intimidating voters, have no place in this country. So again, it's a leap from talking about Shakespeare to talking about current events. But Shakespeare would have found 2020 in America a very familiar place. He wrote about civil war. He understood how quickly societies can unravel. And we are at that point right now. And again, from my work in Shakespeare, whether it's teaching or participating in conversations like this or going to prisons or senior citizen centers, I'm interested instead in seeing it as an alternative to shutting down and closing one's ears, and make it into something that will help us move past the things that we need to discuss, we need to negotiate, and we need to understand better about what our opponents think.
Thank you, Jim. This is a real-time question from Suzanne Vanderhoff from San Jose, California. My group of friends have been live reading a Shakespeare play every weekend since April and have been pleasantly and sometimes unpleasantly shocked by how relevant will is to current events. The hardest for us, as mostly women, was Measure for Measure, which speaks directly to the Me Too movement and the abuse of women and who will listen to them. We are wondering what your thoughts are on Shakespeare's surprisingly pointed and empathetic understanding of that power dynamic.
That's a great example and a great question, and I applaud those who are spending the pandemic immersing themselves in Shakespeare communities and reading the plays. I think that's a healthy and wonderful thing to do. There's a moment in Measure for Measure where Isabella, a young woman who was about to enter a nunnery, is threatened with a choice. The ruler at that moment, Angelo, who's replaced the ruler who has appointed him in his stead. Angelo tells Isabella, if you do not have sex with me, I'm going to kill your brother. And she's put in this impossible bind. And she speaks words that sound so familiar from the Me Too movement. Who will believe me? Who will believe me, a woman without power, without authority? But everybody will believe Angelo, who is at the top of the society. And when I see this play, and I've seen it in the last couple of years in the wake of Me Too, you can just hear a wave sweep over the audience, mostly women, some men as well, a wave of recognition, a wave of identification. And it makes you realize that the issues Shakespeare was writing about 400 years ago are still front and center today. Different ones emerge into prominence or recede from prominence, but they're all there waiting to be activated. And it's always a challenge when directors ask me, what plays do you think we should be doing? I kind of live back in Shakespeare's day much of the time. I have a flip phone. I don't have a social media presence. I'm not as connected with this moment as I might be in certain ways. But I rely on young people to steer me towards what plays speak to our moment, and Measure for Measure, as the example from California, San Jose, California, tells us, is dead center right now in our sights.
Thanks, Jim. This is a question from Russ Britton, class of 1998, from Sequim, Washington. What role does Shakespeare's sense of the place of religion in culture from his plays, from study of his life, suggest about how clergy, clerics may have a role in a divided culture in America?
Probably the greatest division within 16th century England was religious division. The Reformation obviously occurred early on in the 16th century, and in the course of the move from Henry VIII to his son, who was even more Protestant than he, Edward, to his Catholic daughter Mary, to Elizabeth, who was Protestant, the country underwent a series of religious jolts as it struggled to define itself theologically. And Shakespeare's plays are shot through with these concerns. For a while in the 80s and 90s, there were Shakespeare scholars who were arguing that Shakespeare must have been Catholic because of his sympathy for Catholic views, and he had been a closet or crypto Catholic. That's not the case. But I would argue that Shakespeare is attentive, and I'm not sure this addresses exactly the question, so correct me if I'm off target here. But Shakespeare is interested in religious difference. There are characters who are Muslim in his plays, who are Jewish in his plays, who are Catholic in his plays, and who are not only Protestant, but sometimes Puritan in his plays. And he was keenly aware and probably experienced himself the various tensions and tugs between theological positions. We don't really talk much about this in America today. The religious differences in the plays don't matter to us as much as the social and political and gendered one does. But I can easily imagine that changing, and it would be very exciting to discuss those questions.
Thanks, Jim. This is a question from Mary Hiles from Greenville, South Carolina. You mentioned, you mentioned that Shakespeare is taught in our high schools. However, many college and university English departments no longer require Shakespeare. How do you explain that? What should be done about it?
It's an argument that's often used as a stick to beat colleges and universities. My university, Columbia, does not require Shakespeare. I went to Columbia as an undergraduate. And let me tell you, my experience of Shakespeare, you look at me and see an academic Shakespearean and think, oh, this guy must have been reading and studying the Bard from the age of 4. I first was exposed to Shakespeare in junior high and in 9th and 10th grade, and I hated it. I didn't get it. I didn't even get the dirty bits in Romeo that my classmates seemed to get. And I swore I would never take a Shakespeare class again, and never did. Never studied formally in a Shakespeare class, and am largely self-taught as a Shakespearean. In my late teens, I went with my big brother touring around Europe in the 70s, and we ended up in London, and I started seeing Shakespeare plays, and I was hooked. I was addicted. It was like a drug, and better than any other drug that was available at the time. And summer after summer, I'd hold down some job until early August, then fly to London on Freddie Laker's cheap airline and live in church basements or youth hostels and see 30 plays in 30 days. And after 5 or 6 or 7 years of this, all Shakespeare plays, I'd seen 200-300 productions. I would not want to mandate that any college student is required to study any specific subject. It has to come out of love, out of interest, rather than out of being forced to do so. And I know that if not taught well, Shakespeare is as likely to turn off junior high school and high school students as it is to animate them. And I've spent some years directing for the National Endowment for the Humanities secondary school teacher summer seminars in how to teach Shakespeare better. So do I believe Shakespeare should be required? I do not. Do I believe a Shakespeare course should be available at every college and university? Absolutely. And there are an extraordinary number of thrilling teachers. And I would recommend any student who's listening who hasn't taken a Shakespeare course, take the plunge.
This question from Alice Langby, class of 2021 from St. Olaf campus. With Banned Books Week coming up, I've been thinking about censorship versus mitigating harm. As a library lover, I generally come down against censorship, but that doesn't mean that every book needs to be promoted. Neither does every play need to be produced. If we are to assume that every Shakespeare play produced has at least some historical contextualization, is that enough for really hurtful views in some of the plays? Are there some plays we just shouldn't produce anymore?
Again, this is something, especially in recent months, that has come to the fore in conversations among Shakespeareans. And I take a hard line on this, and it's the result of thinking a lot about it. These are words, and there's not a single word in Shakespeare that is violent. There are stories in Shakespeare that are disturbing. There are ways of treating characters, whether it's Shylock or Othello or Caliban or dozens of others, that are difficult. But these are words. And I am terrified at the prospect of censoring words. It's a very, very slippery slope. I understand why people would want to protect students from certain kinds of stories and certain kind of language. I think it's a mistake. I trust young people. I trust their wisdom. I trust their ability to recognize when things are dark, but not to teach Othello because it offends, or not to teach The Merchant of Venice or Measure for Measure. There was a copy of the second folio of Shakespeare in Valladolid, Spain, where English seminarians spent time in the early 17th century. And the inquisitor read through that copy of Shakespeare's works, blotting out lines that offended. And when he came to Measure for Measure, he just ripped the whole play out. Who's going to stop the march to ripping plays out? So I don't want to see that begin, and I would fight censorship as strongly as I could.
Thank you, Jim. This question is from Professor William Soniga from St. Olaf College, a professor of theater. I believe he's co-chair of the theater department at St. Olaf. Regarding the public's production of Julius Caesar, in which Caesar, represented as a Trump-like figure, is brutally assassinated, isn't it a little disingenuous to claim that the goal was mainly to provoke the liberal audience to consider the ethics of its violent anti-democratic revenge fantasies, and that the violent real-world response of the far right to the production was not in some way expected and even desired? Isn't the aim of such blatantly manipulative theatrical representation to arouse the most powerful emotions and to move people, not just to reflect, but to act upon them? I fully agree that a bright line needs to be drawn to protect the cast, the crew, the audience from harm. But certainly Oscar Eustis knew he was playing with real fire in radically polarized political environment, and that as an artist he would be held accountable for the all too real risks that come with it. How do you propose to stage this kind of theatrical violence today and simultaneously expect the audience and others paying attention to sit quietly and engage in civil dialogue about it? That's a tough one.
It's a very pointed and serious question. And I would say it's a question that would not have been asked when this play was being staged until violence erupted in the theater, which is to say, it's easy in 2020 to ask that kind of question. But when this production was taking shape, no one involved in it, and I was involved in it, thought it was incendiary in that way. And I've been involved in incendiary productions. This did not become one until those who had not seen the play, but had only seen a 12-second clip of the assassination of Caesar on Inside America, which was illegally filmed and edited to be provocative, to show, as the screen grab from that production showed, Black people stabbing Donald Trump. So what we're really talking about is not something that affected the theatergoers. Until the first violent right disruption of that production, there had been a total of 6 letters from, at that point, 40,000 people who had seen the play and felt troubled by it. It was the right that turned the image of that assassination scene into a story of race and violence in the same way, frankly, that they're turning the Black Lives Matter protests right now into that story. So I would take a strong stance against that on reality grounds, on historical grounds. Having been there and having recognized people were not coming to see this play and objecting to it. Anybody could have seen that play. The public theater made it free. All you had to do was stand in line that morning. And if you were a Trump supporter, you could stand in line and see it and hoot and holler as much as you wanted in response to that play. But that's not what happened. The controversy largely took place outside the theater, except for people who were paid by Jack Prosebiak, the Pizzagate, and now million Twitter follower right-winger, to disrupt that production. So this is not, you're conflating two things. One, a theater production, which has its own reality in response to audiences. And the other is Fox News and Breitbart and other sites, which capitalize not on the play itself, but on a minuscule clip taken out of context, ripped out of context, that showed a side of America that aligned with their deepest fears and anxieties about the left.
Thank you, Jim. I think we have time for, I'm sorry.
Feel free to follow up on that. I don't need to brush it off. I think it's a very serious question, and I don't want to sound like I was there and know better, but this was not a response of theatergoers. It was a response of pundits.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. This is from Josie from Guilford College. In my class, we have talked about the ways that Shakespearean scholarship itself is a divided and exclusive field. In particular, the reality that violent and racist language and themes which have to be confronted when reading and analyzing works like Othello are less painful for white readers. What do you see as the future of scholarship in these areas? Do you, as an insider, believe the field is moving in a positive and more diverse perspective? What barriers still exist, and how do we overcome them?
I wouldn't say that as a Jew, I have a greater sensitivity to the mistreatment of Shylock in the play. I think readers for centuries have had that. When I read Othello, I feel deeply and painfully the travails and pressures that he experiences. So I would turn that around and I would say, don't you think it better to expose people who are white to Othello, who are Christian to The Merchant of Venice, who are men, young men, thoughtless young men, as I was in my day, to Measure for Measure? That these plays allow us, rather than to invoke a kind of cancel culture response and say, these are too painful, we cannot read these words. I think it's a much better strategy to say, let's all read these words. I would love to sit down with Donald Trump and read through a Shakespeare play carefully and slowly and engagingly with him, because he would leave open the possibility of changing minds. My mind, perhaps, and his mind, perhaps. But I strenuously oppose the idea of thinking that plays are too painful or too difficult. The other half of that question is a very significant one. I'm a white man in his 60s, like most Shakespeare professors, and I think we need far, far greater representation of those involved in teaching Shakespeare, not to be older white men. And I'm now 65. By the time I'm 70, I will step out of the way in the hopes that a young Black or Latinx, ideally woman, will be hired in my stead. And we need those in front of the classroom to reflect different ways of reading these plays. And I think that's crucial, and I can't wait for that day.
Thank you, Jim. We've come to the end of our time. Thanks to the audience for joining us tonight in this engaging substantive exchange with James Shapiro, Columbia University professor, eminent Shakespeare scholar, and author of the recently published Shakespeare and Divided America. Thanks so much to you, Jim, for being with us and sharing with us your remarkable erudition and passion for this subject. The St. Olaf Institute for Freedom and Community has several other virtual events scheduled this fall focused on the presidential election, polarization, pandemic, prejudice. Learn more about these events at institute.stolaf.edu. We hope you can join us. For now, good night, be safe, and be well.